The wind over the Barents Sea in the winter of 1962 did not merely blow, it screamed. It carried with it ice crystals sharp enough to score the perspex of a cockpit canopy. And beneath that howling wind, in the grey vault of the Arctic sky, something had shifted. Something the men of RAF Fighter Command, in their draughty operations rooms at Bentley Priory, had feared for the better part of a decade. The Soviets, patient, methodical, and lately emboldened, had begun to own the roof of the world. They came in waves now, Tupolev Tu-95 Bears with their contra-rotating propellers biting the frozen air. Their turboprop howl audible on Norwegian radio picket ships long before the blips appeared on the screens at Saxa Vord. Behind the Bears came the Myasishchev M-4 Bisons, jet-powered, sleek, and carrying in their bomb bays the unspeakable thermonuclear payloads intended, in the event of war, for Glasgow, for Rosyth, for the sleeping streets of Coventry and Portsmouth. And Britain, that grey and weary island still counting the cost of the last war, had for too long possessed no reliable answer. The Meteor was a museum piece by then. The Hunter, that beautiful hawker gentleman of an aircraft, was subsonic and short-legged. The Javelin, twin-tailed and ungainly, laboured to intercept targets at 40,000 feet, and simply could not reach the altitudes at which the newer Soviet bombers now cruised with contemptuous ease. In the corridors of Whitehall, in the smoke-filled anterooms of the Air Ministry, the phrase muttered in private was blunter than any official assessment. We are losing the ceiling. We are losing the Arctic. And if we lose the Arctic, we lose Britain. The intelligence flowing back to Broadway buildings, home of the Secret Intelligence Service, painted a picture darker still. Agents run out of the Berlin station, defectors debriefed in safe houses across the home counties, signals intercepted by GCHQ's listening posts at Cheadle and Scarborough. All pointed to the same conclusion. Soviet long-range aviation had been rehearsing polar attack routes. They were flying great looping sorties from Olenia and Anadyr, testing the seams of NATO's northern radar chain, probing for the gap between the Icelandic GIU cover and the Norwegian coast. And they were finding it. Again and again they were finding it. Then came the aircraft. The one aircraft, sleek as a razor blade, twin-engined, thin-winged, and capable of speeds no British fighter had ever sustained in operational service. Mach-2, twice the speed of sound, rushed into squadron service with a haste bordering on desperation, its teething troubles unresolved, its pilots retrained in weeks rather than months. It was the English Electric Lightning, and upon its narrow shoulders was placed the burden of restoring the balance of the Arctic sky. This is the story of that aeroplane, and of the men who flew her into the black cold above the Norwegian sea to face down the bear. It is a story of covert reconnaissance, of Whitehall panic, of tradecraft in Moscow, and airmanship over the pack ice. It is a story that has, until recently, remained locked in files stamped top secret UK eyes only. If you value the preservation of British Cold War history and the untold stories of the men who kept the peace in silence, please take a moment to subscribe and like. It is the only way these archives survive. To understand why the Lightning was rushed into being with such indecent haste, one must first understand the shape of the fear that gripped the British defence establishment in the latter half of the 1950s. It was a fear that had been building slowly, then all at once, and it wore many faces. The first face was Bison. In 1954, at the traditional May Day flypast over Red Square, Western military attachés had watched in horrified silence as a formation of what appeared to be at least 10 Myasishchev M-4 four-engined jet bombers thundered overhead. British Air Attaché Group Captain Charles Stewart Richardson had counted them carefully through his field glasses from the balcony of the British Embassy. His signal to London, sent that evening in cipher through the diplomatic bag, was terse. Soviets appear to have achieved operational deployment of intercontinental jet bomber, numbers greater than previously estimated. Assessment revision required urgently. What the attachés did not know and would not know for years was that the Soviets had performed a brilliant piece of maskirovka. The same small handful of Bisons had circled Moscow repeatedly, appearing in successive formations, giving the impression of a fleet several times larger than actually existed. It was a bluff worthy of any Tsarist courtier. And it worked. In Whitehall, in the Pentagon, in the offices of Air Chief Marshal Sir Dermot Boyle, the assessment came down like a hammer. The bomber gap was real. The Soviets were ahead. The second face was bare. Where the Bison was a threat of pure jet velocity, the Tupolev Tu-95 was something altogether more sinister. A long-legged patient hunter with a range of over 8,000 miles, capable of loitering off the British coast for hours, capable of striking from directions no one had planned to defend. Its 4 Kuznetsov turboprops, driving those enormous contra-rotating propellers, produced a noise so distinctive and so loud that Royal Navy sonar operators would later complain the Bear could be heard underwater from remarkable distances. The third face, and the most terrifying, was the emerging Tu-16 Badger in its maritime strike configuration. Armed with the AS-1 Kennel and later the AS-2 Kipper standoff missiles, the Badger did not need to overfly Britain at all. It could launch from 300 miles out and put a warhead onto Scapa Flow, onto the Clyde, onto the great naval anchorages, without ever entering the reach of a conventional interceptor. In the ops room at HMS Warrior, the underground bunker at Northwood from which the Royal Navy directed its Cold War operations, the wall maps grew ever more crowded with red arrows. Every arrow was a Soviet approach vector. Every arrow was a scenario in which Britain's warning time was measured in minutes rather than hours. And behind those maps, behind the sober flag officers with their pipes and their cups of milky tea, sat the awful arithmetic. A single Bear reaching a launch point off the Faroes could deliver a 5-megaton weapon. 5 megatons. Enough in one detonation to erase a British city. The Air Council convened in emergency session. The Chief of the Air Staff, presenting to the Cabinet Defence Committee, spoke plainly. Britain required immediately an interceptor capable of climbing to 60,000 feet in under 3 minutes, capable of sustaining Mach-2 in level flight, capable of engaging a bomber before its missiles could be released. No such aircraft existed anywhere in Western service. Not in America, not in France, and certainly not yet in Britain. But there was a project in Warton, Lancashire, and it was called P-1. The P-1 had been born of the vision of one man and the peculiar genius of a British aircraft firm that had until recently been known chiefly for building locomotives. English Electric, based in Preston, had entered the aviation business almost by accident during the Second World War, subcontracting Halifax bombers. But the man they had hired as chief designer, William Edward Willoughby Petter, known throughout the industry simply as Teddy Petter, was no accident at all. He was a visionary, difficult, brilliant, and possessed of a conviction that the future of air combat lay at speeds and altitudes most of his contemporaries considered fantastical. Petter had left English Electric before the P-1 truly came of age, moving to Folland to design the diminutive Gnat. His successor at Warton, Frederick Page, inherited the project and refined it with a chief test pilot of extraordinary caliber. That pilot was Roland Beamont, wartime typhoon and tempest ace, veteran of the Doodlebug patrols over southern England, a man who had shot down V-1s by tipping their wings with his own. B, as everyone called him, had flown the American F-86 Sabre. He had flown the F-100 Super Sabre. He knew what supersonic flight demanded, and he knew, with an old fighter pilot's certainty, that Britain could do it better. The P-1's configuration was radical. 2 Rolls-Royce Avon engines, stacked vertically, one atop the other, feeding from a single nose intake around which the pilot's cockpit was perched. The wings, swept back at 60 degrees, were so thin that internal fuel storage was almost impossible. A design compromise that would haunt the Lightning throughout its service life. But the arrangement produced an aircraft of astonishing power to weight ratio. When Beaumont first pushed the throttles fully forward in the prototype, WG-760 in August of 1954, at Boscombe Down, the machine leapt from the runway with a savagery that startled even him. Within days he had taken it through the sound barrier in level flight, the first British aircraft ever to do so without the aid of a dive. Ministry of Supply telegrams flew back and forth between Warton and London. Air Vice Marshal Geoffrey Tuttle, the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, visited Warton in person, standing in his greatcoat on the freezing apron, while Beaumont demonstrated a full afterburner climb straight up into the Lancashire cloud. Tuttle, a man not given to sentiment, was reported to have said only 3 words as he watched the aircraft vanish vertically. That will do, but the road from prototype to squadron service was neither short nor easy. The Sandys Defence White Paper of 1957, that infamous document produced by Minister of Defence Duncan Sandys, had declared the manned interceptor obsolete. The future, Sandys proclaimed, lay with surface-to-air missiles. The Bloodhound, the Thunderbird. Aircraft, he suggested, were finished as a defensive tool. Only the sustained, furious opposition of the air staff and the quiet lobbying of men within the SIS, who had seen the true scale of the Soviet bomber program, preserved the Lightning project from cancellation. By 1959, the aircraft was ready. Designated the English Electric Lightning F1, it entered service with 74 Squadron at RAF Coltishall in Norfolk. And the pilots who converted onto it, coming from Hunters and Javelins, found themselves flying an aircraft that behaved less like an aeroplane than like a strapped-on rocket. The transition was brutal. The Lightning did not forgive, but it flew faster, climbed higher, and struck harder than anything the RAF had ever possessed. The Arctic sky, at last, had a new sheriff. The first indication that the Lightning was going to change the game came not from a British source at all, but from a Norwegian one. In the spring of 1960, a Royal Norwegian Air Force radar station at Vardø, perched on the very edge of the Barents Sea within sight of the Soviet coast, tracked something remarkable. An RAF Lightning from a detachment at Andoya had scrambled to intercept a probing Tu-16 Badger that had strayed towards Norwegian airspace. The Norwegian controllers watched, incredulous, as the British aircraft climbed from cold start on the runway to intercept height in a time so short they initially believed their equipment had malfunctioned. The Soviet bomber, which had been comfortably at 42,000 feet expecting no serious interception, suddenly found a British fighter alongside it. The Lightning's pilot, a young flight lieutenant whose name remains classified in the relevant files even now, formated on the Badger for a full 3 minutes, close enough to make eye contact with the Soviet gunner in the tail position, before peeling away in a rolling climb that took him back above the bomber's ceiling. The message was unmistakable, and it was delivered without a shot fired. That message travelled swiftly, not through the pages of any newspaper, for the interception was never publicised, but through the closed channels of Warsaw Pact intelligence assessment. The Soviet Air Defence Forces, the PVO Strany, revised their estimates of British capability upwards, and with them the calculations of long-range aviation's planners. The polar routes that had seemed so promising a year earlier now looked considerably less inviting. The Bear had met the Lightning, and the Bear had blinked. Within the SIS, this revised Soviet assessment was itself an intelligence target of the highest priority. Broadway wanted to know exactly what Moscow now believed about British capabilities, because that belief would shape everything from bomber deployments to negotiating postures at the disarmament talks. And so, in the shadowed world of Cold War tradecraft, an operation was set in motion. A source cultivated over years by the SIS station in a certain Eastern European capital was tasked with acquiring the internal PVO threat assessments. The operation was patient, painstaking, and required 6 dead drops in city parks and one particularly nervous meeting in the back room of a bookseller's shop. When the material finally reached Century House by diplomatic bag 6 months later, translated and analysed by the specialist section that dealt with Soviet air defence matters, the conclusion was electrifying. Moscow had concluded that any large-scale bomber offensive over the North Atlantic in the near term would suffer casualties of 30 to 40% from lightning interception alone. That was a rate of loss no strategic force could sustain. Back at Fighter Command, the operational implications were understood immediately. The Lightning could not defend Britain against a missile-armed bomber attacking from standoff range without itself being pushed further and further out. The Interceptor had to meet the bomber before the missile launch line. That meant range, that meant persistence. That meant refueling in the air. That meant forward basing at RAF Luchas in Fife and detachments to Norway and Iceland. And it meant a new generation of the aircraft itself. The F-1 became the F-2, the F-2 became the F-3, and finally the definitive Interceptor variant, the F-6, with its enlarged ventral fuel tank that transformed the aircraft's endurance from painfully short to genuinely useful. By 1966, the Lightning Force was flying regular patrols in the far north. The Soviets came as they had always come. But now the sky was contested. The intercepts became a ritual played out in the polar half-light, month after month, year after year. The scramble alarm at Luchas would sound at any hour, but most often in the small hours of the morning when long-range aviation preferred to fly its probing sorties. 2 Lightnings would be at cockpit readiness in the Q sheds, pilots strapped in, aircraft plugged into external power, engines cold but ready to light in seconds. When the scramble came, ground crew would already be pulling the chocks as the Avon engines wound up to their characteristic shrieking whine. Takeoff from Luchas in a winter dawn was a peculiar experience according to the pilots who lived through it. The Fife coast slid beneath the wings in shades of iron and pewter, the North Sea a wrinkled sheet of hammered lead. Within 2 minutes the Lightning would be through 20,000 feet, still climbing, still accelerating, the horizon curving noticeably at the edge of vision. The pilot spoke of the moment when the sky above turned from blue to a deep violet black, and the stars became visible in broad daylight. It was, one former squadron leader wrote in his private memoirs, the closest a man could come to leaving the world without actually doing so. The intercepts themselves followed a pattern refined over hundreds of encounters. Ground control at Buchan or Saxa Vord would vector the Lightning onto the target, closing at a combined speed that could exceed 1,500 miles per hour. At around 40 miles, the pilot would acquire the target on his Ferranti AI.23 radar, the little green blip growing steadily on the small circular scope. At 20 miles visual acquisition, the Bear or Bison a black speck against the polar cloud. And then the choreography of the intercept itself closing to formation position on the bomber's wingtip, matching speed and heading, and the long moment when British pilot and Soviet crew regarded one another across 100 feet of freezing air. There were nods sometimes, occasionally a wave. Once famously, a Soviet navigator held up a copy of Pravda to the window, and the RAF pilot, unable to resist, held up his packed lunch. These were not enemies in the sense that men had been enemies at Passchendaele or Alamein. They were professionals engaged in a deadly serious ritual, aware that the men they faced were, in another life, doing the same job for the other side. But there was always tension beneath the professionalism. The Lightning pilot knew that in his ventral pack he carried 2 Firestreak or later red-top air-to-air missiles, and beneath his nose 2 30mm Aden cannon. The Soviet gunners knew this too, and their own tailguns tracked the interceptor throughout the encounter. Everyone understood that one nervous finger, one misinterpreted maneuver, one radio failure at the wrong moment, and the Cold War would abruptly become extremely hot indeed. Now, before we continue to the crisis moments, the times when the professionalism nearly failed and the world came close to hearing the news it dreaded, I want to pose a question to you. When Soviet and British airmen looked across those 100 feet of Arctic sky, seeing each other clearly for the first time, do you believe they saw an enemy or a fellow professional simply serving a different flag? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because these human moments are what history often forgets to record. And if this deep dive into Britain's Cold War defenders is drawing you in, please subscribe. Every subscriber helps us bring these forgotten stories back into the light. The moment that came closest to catastrophe, and which for many years afterwards was known within the RAF only through whispers in officers' messes, occurred in the early autumn of 1968. The context was itself grave. Warsaw Pact forces had invaded Czechoslovakia in August of that year, and NATO's northern flank had gone to an elevated state of alert. Long-range aviation, perhaps to test Western nerve, perhaps under orders whose true purpose has never been declassified from the Russian side, launched an unusually aggressive series of probes down the Norwegian Sea. On the morning in question, 3 Tu-95 Bears departed their base at Olenia and set course southwesterly at a speed and altitude suggesting they meant to press deep towards the Faroe-Iceland Gap. Norwegian radar picked them up first, and the alert flashed down the NATO chain within minutes. At Lucha's, 2 Lightning F-6 of 23 Squadron were scrambled. Their pilots, I shall call them by the call signs used in the still partially redacted after-action report, Redcap 1 and Redcap 2, climbing into a sky heavy with the first hints of the coming Arctic winter. The intercept was made some 350 miles north-northwest of Cape Wrath, in the empty grey vastness between the Faroes and the Norwegian coast. As Redcap 1 closed on the lead bear, however, something was not right. The Soviet formation did not maintain its steady course. Instead, the trailing bomber broke away and began a descent, turning back east, a maneuver never before observed in these encounters. And in the same moment, Redcap 1's radar warning receiver began to chirp. The bear was painting him with fire control radar. The Lightning pilot did precisely what his training told him to do. He broke off the intercept, called the situation over the sector frequency, and began a defensive turn while trying to reacquire the situation. Redcap 2, some 5 miles behind, saw his leads maneuver and turned to support. But now the lead bear was itself descending and closing, and its own tail radar was active. Both British pilots found themselves quite suddenly in a situation for which peacetime doctrine offered no clear answer. They were being illuminated by weapon guidance radar by an aircraft that had never before behaved this way, in the middle of a general NATO alert, 300 miles from the nearest friendly runway. Ground control at Saxa Vord asked, in that calm voice trained into all fighter controllers, whether Redcap 1 wished to declare weapons free. It was the question that no British pilot had ever wanted to hear. Redcap 1, whose real name is now known to be that of a much-decorated squadron leader who would later rise to Air Vice Marshal, later admitted that his hand hovered over the master arm switch for what felt like an eternity, but was, according to the flight recording, precisely 11 seconds. Then the Bears turned away, all 3 of them simultaneously, as if on a single command. The radar warning tones ceased. The Soviet formation climbed back to cruising altitude and set course for Olenia. Whatever had been intended, a probe, a bluff, a test of Western nerve, or something more sinister, was over. Redcap 1 and Redcap 2 escorted the Bears until they turned east of North Cape, then broke off and returned to Lucha's, landing in gathering dusk with less than 3 minutes of fuel remaining. The debrief lasted 7 hours. The report went to the Chief of the Air Staff personally, and thence to the Cabinet Office. It was never published. The incident in the Norwegian Sea prompted a quiet but thorough reassessment within Whitehall of the entire posture of British air defence in the north. If the Soviets were prepared to escalate the game to weapon guidance radar illumination, to what in naval parlance would be called an aggressive lock-on, then the Lightning Force, however capable, required a supporting infrastructure that could not be improvised in the moment. The Interceptor was the sharp end of a spear whose shaft ran back through radar chains, refueling aircraft, forward operating bases, and the shadowy world of signals intelligence. The radar chain itself was upgraded. The linesman system and later improved United Kingdom air defence ground environment brought new long-range surveillance radars to Saxa Vord in the Shetlands, to Buchan in Aberdeenshire, to Bulmer in Northumberland. The RAF's forward radar reporting posts, some of them in the most desolate corners of the British Isles, were manned 24 hours a day by controllers, technicians, and the ubiquitous women of the WRAF, whose calm professionalism at the scopes became a byword throughout Fighter Command. Air-to-air refueling was equally crucial. The Handley Page Victor, that magnificent crescent-winged V-bomber which had been rendered surplus in its original nuclear strike role by the arrival of Polaris, was converted into a superb tanker aircraft. From bases at Marham in Norfolk, Victor tankers extended the reach of the Lightning force enormously, allowing an interceptor to loiter for hours where previously it could barely reach and return. The choreography of a Lightning taking on fuel from a Victor at 30,000 feet over the Norwegian Sea, both aircraft cruising at 300 knots as the pilot flew the delicate ballet of the probe into the drogue, became one of the defining images of British air power in the Cold War. The signal's intelligence dimension was quieter still, and to this day only partly declassified. GCHQ's outstations, from Cheadle in Staffordshire to the Great Array at Menwith Hill in Yorkshire, listened continuously to Soviet air traffic frequencies, to the encrypted uplinks from ground controllers to long-range aviation crews, to the housekeeping chatter of PVO regiments across the Kola Peninsula. Every takeoff from Olenia was noted. Every airborne warning radar switch-on was catalogued. Every unusual pattern was flagged and passed, sometimes within minutes, to the RAF Sector Operations Centre at High Wycombe. The picture that emerged from this fusion of intelligence and operational reality was one that reshaped British strategic thinking. The Soviet threat was neither the crude armada of the popular imagination, nor the paper tiger that some post-Sandys revisionists claimed. It was rather a highly professional, well-drilled and steadily improving force whose commanders were themselves learning the game as it was played. Each intercept was, for both sides, a piece of intelligence. Each unusual maneuver was studied. Each new Soviet aircraft type, the Tu-22 blinder, the Tu-95K missile carrier, the Tu-22M backfire when it eventually emerged in the 1970s, was met by a British countermeasure, sometimes an equipment upgrade to the Lightning, sometimes a change in tactics, sometimes a new intelligence collection effort. The Lightning itself, meanwhile, was aging. By the early 1970s, the airframes were showing their years. The fuel fraction problem had never been fully solved. The avionics, once revolutionary, were increasingly outclassed. The pilots continued to fly her with the affection reserved for a temperamental but beautiful mistress. But at Whitehall, the question was already being asked. What next? The answer, when it came, would be American. But that is another story for another day. In the meantime, the Lightning soldiered on into the 1980s, still Britain's high Arctic sword. By the end of the 1970s, the character of the Cold War over the polar regions had shifted in ways that even the most senior planners at the Ministry of Defense found difficult to fully articulate. The Soviet Union, under Brezhnev's aging hand, had achieved a degree of strategic parity with the West that would have seemed impossible in the panicked days of 1954. Its long-range bombers were more capable, its standoff missiles more accurate, its polar routing more sophisticated. And yet, paradoxically, the intensity of the air-to-air interceptions in the far north had not declined. If anything, it had increased. The reason lay partly in the arrival of the Tu-22M backfire, an aircraft that combined for the first time the speed of the earlier blinder with the range of the Bear. Backfire, in British assessments, was the first Soviet bomber that could credibly threaten the entire United Kingdom from bases inside Soviet airspace, while operating at speeds that made interception extraordinarily difficult. The Lightning could catch a Bear, it could catch a Bison, it could at some effort catch a blinder. Whether it could reliably catch a backfire in a stern chase was, in the honest assessment of the operational research staff at Farnborough, doubtful. And yet the Lightning was still what Britain had, and Lightning pilots continued to fly the intercepts with a professionalism that never wavered. The last operational Lightning squadrons, 5 and 11 at Binbrook in Lincolnshire, became a kind of living museum of Cold War airmanship. their pilots trained in techniques and tactics that had been refined over more than 2 decades of Arctic patrol. When a Bear appeared on the scope in 1985, or 1986 or 1987, it was met by an aircraft that had been designed in the mid-1950s but flown by pilots whose competence at the specific task was arguably unmatched anywhere in NATO. There is a story told and retold in the Binbrook officers' mess of an intercept flown in the winter of 1987. A pair of Bears approached the northern airspace on what appeared to be a routine probe. 2 Lightnings scrambled from Binbrook, refueled from a Victor over the Shetlands, and made the intercept some 400 miles east of the Faroes. The Soviet pilot in the lead Bear, according to the account, held up a hand-lettered sign to his window as the British aircraft formated. The sign read simply, in painstakingly formed English letters, "Goodbye, Lightning." The British pilot, taken aback, held up his own hastily scribbled reply, "Not yet." But the Bear pilot had, of course, been right. In April of 1988, the last Lightning intercept squadrons stood down. The aircraft were replaced, some by the Phantom FGR.2, which had been serving alongside them for years, and ultimately by the Panavia Tornado F3, an aircraft that could carry more missiles further and detect targets at greater ranges, but which had, in the private opinion of many old Lightning hands, none of the raw, savage joy of their departing steed. The men who had flown the Lightning through those long Arctic decades scattered as such men always do. Some became instructors, some went to civil aviation. Some retired to Lincolnshire villages and kept quiet gardens and did not talk much about what they had done. A few wrote memoirs, most did not. And the aircraft themselves, the survivors, went to museums or to grateful preservation groups or to the smelter's yard. But the sky they had guarded remained. It remained still. And the men who flew there in that fastest of British-built interceptors had done their duty in the highest tradition of the Royal Air Force. They had held the ceiling. To close, one must reflect on what the Lightning story actually meant in the great cold accounting of the Cold War. It is easy from the vantage of the 21st century to dismiss the whole northern air defense effort as theatre, an elaborate ritual whose real significance was symbolic, whose deterrent value was marginal, whose expenditure of national treasure could have been better spent on schools or hospitals. It is easy, but it is wrong. The Lightning mattered because deterrence is not an abstraction. It lives or dies in the mind of the potential aggressor. When Soviet air planners in Moscow drew up their contingency documents through the 1960s and 1970s, when they calculated the survivability of a strategic bomber offensive against the British Isles and the North Atlantic sea lanes upon which reinforcement of Europe would depend, they had to factor in the Lightning. They had to factor in the fact that a British interceptor of world-class performance would rise to meet them, that it would be vectored by radar chains they could not easily blind, that it would be flown by men who had trained relentlessly for exactly this eventuality. The calculation was not favourable to Soviet planning, and the calculation was itself a form of victory, won without a shot fired. More than that, the Lightning represented a British commitment. In an era when American nuclear guarantees and later American conventional power dominated Western defence thinking, Britain's insistence on maintaining an indigenous high-performance interceptor force was a statement about sovereignty and about seriousness. Britain would not simply be defended by others. Britain would defend herself and would contribute to the defence of her allies, with an aircraft built in Preston by British hands and flown by British pilots. The moral weight of that commitment mattered in Washington, in Bonn, in Paris, and most of all in Moscow. The men who flew the Lightning and the men and women who supported her, the engineers at Wharton, the ground crew at Leuchars and Binbrook, the controllers at Saxa Vord and Buchan, the SIS officers who ran the sources whose intelligence shaped the operational picture, the GCHQ analysts who listened through the polar nights. All of them contributed to a defensive posture that helped hold the peace through the most dangerous decades of the 20th century. The peace was not held by accident. It was held by ceaseless, professional, largely invisible work. by people whose names are, in most cases, unknown outside their own families and squadrons. The Lightning is now, in every operational sense, a relic. The last airworthy examples fly at private air shows in South Africa, and occasionally at British commemorative events. But the story she carries with her of a nation that responded to the gravest threat in its history with an aircraft rushed into being, refined under fire of Cold War intelligence duel, and flown into the Arctic dark by men who understood exactly what they were doing and why, that story is not a relic. It is a living inheritance. If you found this account of Britain's High Arctic Guardian meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing these Cold War stories out of the classified files and into the light where they belong. And do watch the next episode, in which we shall follow the trail of British Cold War airmanship into another shadowed corner of that long grey conflict. The bear may have gone home. The story of those who watched him is only beginning to be told.